Okay, so you're interested in criminal psychology, right?
Yeah, it seems to be something that really captures people's attention these days.
Yeah, for sure. You see it everywhere in like TV shows,
Yeah.
movies, books,
Exactly.
like all these like the brilliant but kind of troubled, criminal
The
profilers.
ones who can get inside the mind of a serial killer and all that.
Right, exactly. It's always so dramatic,
Very dramatic.
but also like a little bit misleading maybe, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes for good TV, but the reality of criminal psychology is much broader than that.
Right, much more to it than just like, interviewing serious offenders and trying to like predict their next move.
Right. And even those things happen in a much more nuanced way in real life.
Hmm. Yeah, so we thought we would do like a deep dive, into what criminal psychology really is and what criminal psychologists actually do.
Yeah, let's unpack all of that because it's way more than just, the stuff you see on those crime procedurals.
Exactly. So we're talking about people who work with the police to, assist with investigations,
Mhm.
and they might advise on interview techniques, or they could be called in as expert witnesses in court.
Right. And let's not forget the work they do in offender rehabilitation, helping people who have committed crimes to turn their lives around.
Yeah, and all the research they do trying to understand the root causes of crime and how to prevent it.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about the academics who are training the next generation of criminal psychologists.
Oh, yeah, that's right. So it's a really diverse field with lots of different areas of specialization.
Definitely.
So our mission today is to really give you a balanced understanding of criminal psychology.
A more realistic picture.
Exactly, and to show you how its applications within the criminal justice process are really quite diverse.
We'll kind of follow it through the different stages of the criminal justice system and see how psychologists contribute at each point.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So where should we begin?
Well, I think it's important to start by acknowledging that even defining criminal psychology can be a bit tricky.
Oh, yeah, how so?
Well, there isn't really one universally accepted definition.
Oh, interesting.
The field has evolved so much over time.
Okay.
Back in 1998, Gudinson and Howard, two really influential figures in the field in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
they defined it as that branch of applied psychology, which is concerned with the collection, examination, and presentation of evidence for judicial purposes.
So that definition seems to put a lot of emphasis on the investigative and court processes.
Yeah, it's very much focused on gathering evidence and presenting it in a way that's helpful to the courts.
But that feels a little narrow, doesn't it, considering how much the field has expanded?
You're right, it doesn't really capture the full scope of what criminal psychologists do today.
Especially when you think about all the work that happens after sentencing,
Yeah.
with things like offender rehabilitation and reintegration.
Exactly. That aspect is becoming increasingly important, and that earlier definition just doesn't really account for it.
So is there a more up-to-date definition that we can use?
Yeah, in 2001, Reitzman, an American psychologist, offered a broader definition. He said that criminal psychology is any application of psychological knowledge or methods for a task faced by the legal system.
Okay, so that's much more inclusive.
Right. It encompasses the entire legal system from the beginning of an investigation all the way through to post-sentence work.
So it acknowledges that criminal psychologists aren't just involved in investigations and trials, but in all areas of the judicial process.
Exactly. Their expertise can be applied to a wide range of tasks and challenges that the legal system faces.
So to help us understand these different contributions, maybe we can look at some specific roles that criminal psychologists take on.
Yeah, that's a great idea. There's a really helpful framework developed by Professor Lionel Howard back in 1981.
Okay.
He identified 4 key roles that psychologists often play when they're professionally involved in criminal proceedings.
And these are still relevant today.
Absolutely. There's
Yeah.
still a great way to understand the breadth of the field and how psychologists contribute.
So let's dive into those 4 roles.
Okay, the first one is the clinical role.
Okay, so the clinical role, what does that involve?
Well, in this role, the psychologist is primarily focused on assessing individuals
Okay.
to provide a clinical judgment about their mental state or functioning.
So they're using their psychological expertise to evaluate a specific person.
Exactly. And they might use a variety of tools for this.
Like what kind of tools?
Well, they might conduct in-depth interviews with the individual.
Okay.
They might use standardized assessment tools.
Like what?
Well, there are lots of different tools depending on what they're trying to assess. But, for example, they might use a personality inventory to measure someone's personality traits.
Okay.
Or they might use a risk assessment tool to evaluate the likelihood that someone will reoffend.
I see.
And they might also use psychometric tests.
Psychometric tests, what are those?
They're basically specialized questionnaires designed to measure specific psychological characteristics.
Okay.
So, for example, there are psychometric tests that measure intelligence or cognitive abilities,
Hmm.
and there are tests that measure things like anxiety or depression.
So these assessments can provide valuable information to different parts of the legal system.
Exactly.
For example, the police might use this information to understand a suspect's behavior,
Right.
and the courts might use it to determine whether someone is fit to stand trial.
hmm And prison and probation services might use it to design rehabilitation programs.
Okay, so can you give me a really concrete example of how this clinical role might play out in a real-world scenario?
Sure. So, one really important example is when a psychologist is asked to evaluate an individual's fitness to stand trial.
Okay.
This is a crucial determination because it essentially assesses whether someone is mentally capable of participating in their own defense.
So it's not just about whether they're physically present in court.
Right. It's about whether they understand the charges against them,
Oh.
whether they can communicate effectively with their lawyer,
Hmm.
and whether they can make rational decisions about their legal strategy.
So a psychologist would assess all of that.
Exactly. They would use interviews, psychometric testing, and other assessment tools to determine whether the individual meets the legal criteria for fitness to stand trial.
Wow, that's a huge responsibility.
It is, and it's a really important safeguard to ensure that people aren't being tried unfairly.
Right, because if someone doesn't understand what's happening or can't properly defend themselves, that's not a fair trial.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a great example of the clinical role. Now, what about the experimental role? How is that different?
So the experimental role is less about assessing individuals and more about using research methods to inform a specific case or legal question.
Okay, so it's more focused on the research side of things.
Exactly. And there are a couple of key ways that this can happen.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, one way is by actually designing and carrying out specific experiments that are relevant to the case at hand.
So, like creating a mini research project tailored to the specific details of the case.
Yeah, exactly. A psychologist might set up a study to test a particular hypothesis or to provide data that's directly relevant to the court's deliberations.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. So imagine a case where the key evidence is eyewitness testimony.
Okay.
A psychologist might conduct an experiment to investigate how reliable memory is under specific conditions.
Oh, I see.
Like they might try to recreate the lighting conditions or the level of stress that the witness experienced.
To see how those factors might have affected their memory?
Right.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Yeah. Or another example might be a case where someone is accused of a crime that happened at night,
Okay.
and the psychologist might conduct an experiment to see how accurately people can identify objects or faces in low light.
That would be really helpful information for the court to have.
Exactly. It helps them to evaluate the reliability of the evidence and to make more informed decisions.
So it's about bringing scientific rigor to the legal process.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's one way that the experimental role can play out. What's the other way?
The other way is by providing the court with a summary of existing research findings that are relevant to the case.
Oh, okay. So instead of conducting new experiments, they're drawing on the existing body of knowledge.
Right. They might review all of the published research on a particular topic,
Uh-huh.
like eyewitness identification or the effects of stress on memory,
Mm-hmm.
and they would present this information to the court in a way that's clear and understandable.
So they're acting as like a bridge between the world of research and the legal system.
Exactly. They're helping to ensure that the court has access to the most up-to-date scientific understanding.
So that their decisions are based on the best available evidence.
Right.
Okay, so that's the experimental role. Now, what about the actuarial role? That one sounds a little bit intimidating.
Well, it does have a kind of technical ring to it,
Yeah.
but it's really not that complicated.
Okay, well, tell me more.
Basically, the actuarial role involves using statistics to inform a case.
Statistics in the courtroom? That's interesting.
Yeah, it's not always what people think of when they think of psychology, but it's a really important part of the field.
So how does it work in practice?
Well, a key example is when a psychologist is asked to present statistical data about the probability of a particular event occurring.
Like what kind of event?
Well, a common example is risk assessment. So,
Yeah.
predicting the likelihood that someone will commit another crime in the future.
Oh, okay, so that's really important information for the court to have.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially when they're making decisions about sentencing.
Right, because they need to consider the risk that the offender poses to the community.
Exactly.
So how does a psychologist go about doing that?
Well, they would draw on statistical data, often from large-scale studies, that have tracked the behavior of offenders over time.
Uh-huh.
And they would use this data to develop statistical models that can predict the likelihood of reoffending.
I see.
So they might look at factors like the offender's age,
Okay.
their criminal history,
Uh,
their substance abuse history,
mhm.
and other relevant variables.
And then they use all of that information to calculate a risk score.
Exactly. And this risk score can be really helpful for the court.
Because it gives them a more objective way to assess the risk that the offender poses.
Right. It takes some of the guesswork out of it, and it allows them to make more data-driven decisions.
Okay, so that's the actuarial role. Very interesting.
Mm.
Now, what about the final role, the advisory role?
Okay, so the advisory role is all about providing advice and guidance to different actors within the criminal justice system.
So this is where the psychologist really gets to share their expertise and help to shape the legal process.
Exactly.
So who might they be advising?
Well, it could be anyone, really, but some common recipients of advice are the police,
Okay.
prosecution lawyers, and defense lawyers.
So what kind of advice might they give to the police, for example?
Well, they might advise on how an offender's psychological characteristics can help to narrow down potential suspects.
Oh, okay. So they're using their understanding of psychology to help with the investigation.
Exactly. They might look at the crime scene,
Mhm.
the victim's profile,
Mhm.
and other available information.
And then use that to develop a profile of the likely offender.
Yeah, right. And this profile can help the police to focus their investigation and to identify potential suspects more quickly.
That's really valuable.
Yeah, and they might also advise on the best techniques for interviewing suspects.
Oh, okay. So like how to get the most accurate and reliable information from someone who might be trying to deceive them.
Exactly. They can provide guidance on how to build rapport with the suspect,
Uh-huh.
how to ask questions in a way that's likely to elicit truthful responses,
Mm-hmm.
and how to avoid techniques that might lead to false confessions.
Wow, that's so important.
It is, because false confessions can have really devastating consequences.
Okay, so what about the advice that they might give to lawyers?
Well, they can advise on a wide range of issues, but one common area is witness testimony.
Okay.
They can advise on how to prepare witnesses for trial,
Mm-hmm.
how to cross-examine witnesses effectively,
Mm-hmm.
and how to challenge the testimony of other expert witnesses.
I see.
They can also advise on legal strategy more broadly, like how to present evidence in a way that's persuasive to the jury,
Mm-hmm.
and how to address any psychological factors that might be relevant to the case.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really about using their psychological expertise to help lawyers to build the strongest possible case.
Whether it's for the prosecution or the defense.
Exactly.
So these four roles, the clinical, the experimental, the actuarial, and the advisory, really paint a vivid picture of the diverse ways that criminal psychologists contribute to the legal system.
Yeah, it really shows you how much more there is to it than just the sensationalized stuff you see on TV.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this is not an exhaustive list.
So there are many other ways that criminal psychologists are involved in the criminal justice process.
But these four roles give us a good starting point for understanding the breadth and depth of their involvement.
Absolutely.
So to kind of wrap things up, I think the key takeaway here is that criminal psychology is a much more complex and multifaceted field than many people realize.
Yes.
Professionals in this area play a vital role in ensuring that the legal system is fair and just,
Mm,
and that decisions are based on the best available evidence.
right.
And I think it's really important for us as citizens to have a better understanding of what they do,
Agree.
because it helps us to appreciate the complexity of the legal system
Mm,
and to have more informed discussions about criminal justice issues.
exactly.
So thank you for joining us for this deep dive into criminal psychology.
It's been a pleasure.
And we'll leave you with one final thought to ponder.
Okay.
Given the diverse roles that criminal psychologists play within the legal system,
Uh-huh.
what ethical considerations might arise?
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, something to think about.
Definitely.
Until next time.
Goodbye.
Bye.